Welcome, everybody, to Buddhism Talks. Today, we're going to be talking about the life of Nichiren Daishonin. I've had quite a few people mention to me how I quote Nichiren. I have mentioned a little bit about his life, but they would like to hear more about the history of his life and the significance of his teachings in 2025 and why they are actually more relevant than ever. So I thought about who could I speak to that could help me do this presentation and have a really rich discussion on the life of Nichiren Daishonin. And of course, I thought about my friend Ned Boyden, who lives in Vancouver. And the reason I thought of Ned is not only has he been chanting for a long time, but his very first inspiration in terms of Buddhism was a writing from Nichiren Daishonin called The Heritage of the Ultimate Law of Life. He is somebody who has studied Nichiren's writings the whole time he's been practicing very sincerely. And as he told me recently, he always even reads the footnotes. I think, Ned, you start off with the footnotes, right? So, and the other thing about Ned that's really amazing is out of his very sincere desire to want to humanize Nichiren Daishonin and to really make some of the stories and some of the writings come to life, he spent years doing incredible research, and he was able to publish a book called In the Valley of Pine Needles, Stories of Historical Fiction Based on the Life and Times of Nichiren Daishonin. So, welcome, Ned. I'm so happy to have you here to relax and chat about Nichiren's life and share some of our experiences in terms of this Buddhism, in terms of studying these writings. So before we get to Nichiren Daishonin's life, I want to spend a little bit of time hearing about Ned's life and how he started to practice.
Thank you, Lydia. Well, I started this practice in 1977. And, at the time, I was a musician and a nationally ranked athlete, and I was based in Winnipeg. And I moved to Vancouver in the fall, September, and I got a job at a restaurant. And I walked in, and there was a guy there that had been my roommate when I was 16, because I left home quite young. And he's like, "Oh, hey, come to my house. We'll smoke pot." And I was like, yeah. I mean, if you wanted to get me anywhere, that's all you had to say. I was a very high functioning person, but I had a lot of trauma in my life and a lot of things going on. But I did go and I went in and we smoked pot, and he just jumped up and ran off. He said, "I got to go." And I'm sitting there in this basement suite going, where'd the guy go? So I thought I'd follow him, and I went through this room, and there was some stairs, and I went up, and there was a kitchen and nobody there. Went through, and there was one more room, and I keep going. I went around another corner. There's all these people sitting on the floor going, and I was like, so my first thought was, oh, they must be communists or something. I mean, it was kind of weird. So my friend was there, and he looked up and he pulled me down and put a book in front of my face, which was the Lotus Sutra. I didn't know, of course. And I just sat there like, what is this? And then the meeting started, and actually, I could see the people were really sincere. And I knew nothing about Buddhism. Like, I knew the word Buddha. I thought he was some sort of garden ornament, basically. And I'd
Mm-hmm.
heard the word karma because of the Beatles song, "Instant Karma is going to get you." So, like, that was literally my exposure to Buddhism. But at the end of the meeting, I bought a Gongyo book, which is what we recite every day, the daily practice. And they had these 3 pamphlets, which was a lecture by Daisaku Ikeda on the Gosho, The Heritage of the Ultimate Law of Life. And I took it home and I opened it up, and my eyes went, whoom. And I stayed up all night and read it. And of course, the themes of that writing are life and death. And my mom had taken her own life about 3 years before that, when I was 17. And that had put me into it. Well, I had already been in a pit of self-medication since I was 14 in my life. And by that time, I was so in it, I didn't even know it wasn't normal or healthy. So that's the circumstances I started chanting under, was really like that. But right away, reading the writings of Nichiren Daishonin were just like revelatory, to start to see the nature of what I'd experienced, and why my mom had passed away, and what could be the circumstances, and how I could do something positive about it. I think that was the most important thing. So yeah, so that was basically, and I kept going, and it's been 48 years, and I still love
Amazing.
chanting every day, and I love Nichiren's writings even more than I did back then. So
That's amazing. And it's funny because Nichiren says, if you want to understand life, first you must understand death. It sounds like you began your practice with wanting to understand life and death, in particular, death in this case. And in that seeking mind, you were able to connect with the practice and begin from that kind of base question about life and death. Thank you so much. There's two reasons why I really wanted to do this podcast with Ned. Number one, he has always had a real passion for studying Nichiren's writings from the very beginning. And also, he really wanted to help people make a personal connection with Nichiren Daishonin. He thought about, how can I make the life of Nichiren Daishonin more accessible and more real, and also convey some of the closeness that Ned felt about Nichiren Daishonin. And how could he do that? And so he decided to write a book. He spent a long time doing research to make sure that historical facts were accurate, but also they are stories. It is historical fiction. So with that kind of commitment and levels of research, I thought this would be an amazing chance to talk to Ned about some of the things he learned doing that research, and just his general experience. Before we get into Ned's experience and particularly his experience in writing the book, I wanted to give you a very short background, a little bit about Nichiren Daishonin. He was born in 1222 in Japan, and he lived for 60 years and passed away in 1282. He was a Buddhist scholar, he was a Buddhist priest, and from the age of 12 years old, he decided that he would become the wisest man in Japan, not from a place of ego, but he wanted to understand why there was so much suffering, and also why Buddhism wasn't providing the solutions that he would expect it to. There was pandemics, there was famines, there was so much suffering happening in Japan at that time. And so he decided to go through all the Buddhist teachings and figure out what was happening. And then on April 28th, 1253, he revealed Nam-myoho Renge Kyo as the chant that captured the heart of the Buddha's intent and really allowed everybody equal access to their Buddha nature. He also inscribed something called the Gohonzen, which is the mandala that we chant in front of, that is meant to be a mirror for our lives. It is meant to be an object that reminds us of our potential Buddhahood. We don't worship the Gohonzen, rather, it is there to remind us that we have Buddhahood within our own lives. So it is a depiction of Buddhahood so that we can remember that we actually have Buddhahood. And so those were his two major achievements in terms of evolving Buddhism, revealing a chant and inscribing the Gohonzen, among many other things. But I would say those are the two things that gave access to everybody. And I always say, including my 65-year-old Croatian grandmother. So his compassion was so great that he was able to reveal a practice that would really allow everybody access. His essence was that he was a revolutionary. His life's work led to a concrete way for anyone to reveal their enlightened nature. And because of that, he was immediately attacked. And that's the thing that always amazes me. He was this one single man with no money, no fame, no status. And yet, the persecution and the onslaughts of oppression from the government were shocking. They would send hundreds of soldiers to his door. And it was simply because he was expounding the truth that all people have the potential for Buddhahood, and they are equal in their potential for that. Everybody, in fact, can be a Buddha. And that's what caused all the oppression, is that truth. Is there anything, Ned, you want to say in general about his life? Like some of the key things people should know right off the bat?
Yeah, I would feel like I'd like to express why I get excited about Nichiren's writings. Finding out about him really has been a big influence on my life. And the number one thing is his courage. And it was a courage that was totally directed towards the betterment of society and individual life. And I've always really respected that. The second thing for me is his logic. He never made wild statements that denigrated people. He was always so meticulous about everything he said matched exactly with the things the first Buddha on this planet, Shakyamuni, had said, because they're very importantly connected. Because what Shakyamuni actually said were things that were describing the circumstance in which a person would appear to reveal a law by which everybody could bring out their Buddha nature. And this was
Uh-huh.
Shakyamuni's purpose in teaching the Lotus Sutra all those years ago. And Nichiren was the one that came and matched that. And he wasn't arrogant about it, but he was just an amazing person. His care and love of his followers was unparalleled. You know, the number of letters that were written to women was unbelievable. And for that time, you think even that in itself was like, wow, you know. So he was a human rights advocate who was way ahead of his time in an age when humans didn't have any rights. So that was enough for me. When you read Nietzsche's writings, you're actually exposed to his spirit and courage, and it infiltrates our own life. I think it's you that said it's like getting an IV of courage to read it. And I feel exactly the same way.
Ned, what are some of the surprising things that you learned about him that your average person might not know?
Well, I think you covered it really well, a lot of his life and that. I mean, for me, I think the breadth of his knowledge really surprised me. I didn't realize that he had such an understanding of the Japanese legal system, and those things came out as I went through. And when you look at periods of his life when his followers were arrested, for example, the Atsuhara martyrs, they call them, and the lengths that he and Nico Shonin, his successor, went through to challenge legally was amazing, you know, when I started to see that. So that was quite interesting. And sort of an interesting aside was I found out that I don't know a lot about the game Go, the Japanese chess, I guess you would call it. But he was the first person to actually uh, make note of a certain move, which is a common thing. There's a name for it, and I'm not quite sure what it is. But when you have a play that's made that's successful, you make note of it and you draw a diagram. And he was the
Uh-huh.
first person to do one of those. So he was a very broad person. He wasn't this dour Buddhist sage that just was running around being dogmatic. He actually had a really clear purpose. And a thing that I feel that sums it all up is Nichiren was looking for a fight. That's how I feel. There was nothing about him that was like acquiescent. We think of Buddhist leaders as sort of this transcendental type stuff. He found the truth. He saw that if he revealed it, he was going to be really in big trouble because the Lotus Sutra explains what will happen to the person that brings out this law that you mentioned, Nam-myoho Renge-kyo. But Nichiren just
Mhm.
went right for it and never ever backed off for the whole period of his life that he did it. So I think those things to me were what I would say was really attractive about him and made me want
Uh-huh.
to go further. And you find somebody that's a real deal, right? You want to
Yes.
find out more about them, and that's how I felt about Nichiren.
Yeah. You're saying something about his calligraphy being exceptionally beautiful?
In fact, his is a really good example of the Kamakura era. And like you mentioned, he was considered to be one of the most learned men of the Kamakura period. A lot of the historical information, people use him as a source material because he was so accurate and very meticulous about real things. Nothing Nichiren writes was a wild statement. It's always grounded in maybe a government record because the Japanese were wonderful about keeping track of everything about the weather and events. Everything he says is verified within those as well as his own writings. That was something that really interested me, that he was so grounded in reality and not just somebody that was telling fairy tales to make people feel good about what they're doing,
Yeah.
right?
So they
Yeah,
would follow him, right? That wasn't the
exactly.
point. Because and when you say that, many of the writing, he is making a case. It's almost like a
Yep.
lawyer, actually.
Yeah, very much so. I think that's what
Now
I
that
like
you
so much. Yeah.
yeah, like when you said that he knew the legal system, right? So he knew how to debate. That's the other thing. He was excellent at debate. He would take on anybody in debate, and he knew how to make the case, right? And so that's why you had some of his writings, like Risho and Kokuran, on establishing the correct teaching for the peace of the land. That is a dialogue and it is a presentation of a case. One person says something, well, this is the proof for that. You say this, well, then this is the proof for that. And that's just another aspect of his writing and his approach that
Yes.
I've also always respected. That reminds me of another point is the fact that his writings are actually available still in his
Yes,
hand.
that's
That's
right.
very rare thing in terms of our Buddhism is we actually have the original writings by the person. It's in his own hand. Some of them are excerpts and bits and pieces have his letters. There's no interpretation in between. We can read it directly.
Yes, and we can really thank, a few people along the way. Nichiko Hori, who was a priest of the 20th century, early 20th century, who did nothing but research and travel around collecting writings anywhere he could find them and hidden away in temples. Some were lost in fires. And then, of course, he worked with Josei Toda, the second president of the Soka Gakkai, to create the hallmark version of Nichiren's writings that we use today. So we're really to be born at this time of history when things have developed to the point where the Soka Gakkai has an incredible study department and translation department. And so everything we're getting is really well researched and we can read it.
So I didn't know that. So you said Nichiko Hori, who went around Japan collecting and making sure we had all of Nichiren's actual letters?
He appears like in the Human Revolution that was written by Daisaku Ikeda, the history of the Soka Gakkai. There's a portion about him, and he was a high priest, but he didn't really want to be. He didn't like the administrative stuff. And then there was a real problem within what was called Nichiren Shoshu at the time. These families were fighting to be able to be the high priest, and they couldn't resolve it. So they asked him to come back. So he begrudgingly came back and was high priest for a little while. And then after that, he was like, no way. And they used to say that he would tell people, what I want to do is I want to have a tunnel that goes from my house to the library. And I could just go there every day and not run into anybody. And I liked him. There's great pictures of him. He's got big bushy eyebrows, but he really respected Josei Toda. And of course, Toda was a fabulous editor in his own right, having had magazines and things before the
Yeah,
war.
he was a publisher, right? Yeah, he was a
Absolutely. He published Makaguchi's first writing
yeah.
or second writing, sorry. But anyway, so he's an interesting figure because he was purely about maintaining the purity and accurately conveying Nichiren's writings. So
Yeah.
it's kind of interesting that Nichiko, based on that, he traveled to Sado Island, to all the places where Nichiren had been exiled to find if there was even a scrap of something. So, you look at volume 2 of the major writings of Nichiren Goshu, there's a whole bunch of pages and pages at the end of these wee little ones that are like a
Yeah, little
paragraph.
excerpts.
Yeah, but they're some of the best. I read them. I'm like, wow, this is so cool. It's like to this person, it was like, can you look after the lecture next month? This person isn't available, and I'm going to be away. And I was thinking, it's just like today when we're planning our discussion meeting. Gee, should we have it on Tuesday? I don't know if this house is available. Can we move it? And I thought some things never change.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I got to admit, I haven't read much of volume 2. And for anybody who doesn't know, volume 1 looks like this. It's very thick. Most people don't read the whole volume. And it's also thin pages. It's not Bible, but it's very thin pages. So volume 1 is already a big undertaking to read everything that's in there. And then volume 2 is about the same size. And then there's orally transmitted teachings as well, which, as the title says, were essentially Nichiren's lectures as written down by Nikko Shonin, right? The second high priest after Nichiren Daishonin passed away. So there's a lot there, but yeah, in volume 2, I haven't actually read. I mean, I looked at it a little bit, glanced at a few things, but I noticed the same what you just said. There's like it's a writing, and it's just like a couple of sentences. You could almost imagine it as being like, oh, they found scraps of the paper, like part of it had been ripped off, some of it might have been burnt off. Who knows what happened to it, but they treasured that little scrap that was left, and it went into volume 2. So the other thing that I just want to cover is, why do we study Nichiren's writings? And there are just so many reasons. And the first big one is this practice is based on 3 pillars: faith, practice, study. So that third one, it's important that we study. And Buddhism starts with this idea of a seeking spirit, of questions, of trying to figure life out. So you have to have somewhere to go. to read, to study. That's one part, but we mostly study to be able to apply it to our daily lives. Like, we don't do academic theoretical study. When I read Nietzsche's writings, it's because I want an answer to something. I want to figure something out. So it's meant to be used in our daily lives. I've got here actually from a presentation that Ned did once. He said, reading one passage with our life can change everything. And that's the kind of attitude we have when we read Nietzsche's writings. At times when I've been down or struggling with something, and I just go back to that writing that says Nam Myoho Renge Kyo is like the roar of a lion, right? That's all I need. That one line. It's like, oh yeah, what am I doing? Let's go. The other thing is that Nietzsche's encouragement is just as valid now as it was 700 years ago. The Gosho is a work of faith, of philosophy, of daily living, of eternal peace, and of boundless hope. So that's why we study Nietzsche's writing. That's it right there. Philosophy, a source of hope. It's also a source of courage and guidance on daily living. Ultimately, we read Nietzsche's writings to have a shift in our heart. You know, these are teachings that are meant to be read with our heart that really affect us from that place. When I think of Jose Toda, the second president, there's a beautiful quote from him, and he says, when reading the Daishonin's writings, even more than trying to understand the meaning of his words, I seek to come into contact with the Buddha's immense compassion, his towering conviction, his ardent spirit to protect and save the people, and his single-minded and solemn commitment to Kozen Rufu. Whenever I read the Gosho, his brilliant spirit, like a midsummer sun at noon, floods my heart.
That passage from Jose Toda really inspired me. I remember it. One thing I feel from it is it's very difficult what Nichiren did. And I don't think there's anybody that could do what he did, which is he traveled constantly for years and years to every major temple in Japan to research and understand why things were the way they were, like you said. And he came to the conclusion that the Lotus Sutra was the highest teaching. He accomplished that.
Hmm.
So reading directly his stuff really enables us to feel that spirit. But it was lost for a long time. And the three founding presidents of the Soka Gakkai, in particular Mr. Tsunosaburo Makaguchi, the first president, you know, when he appeared, everything had been kind of lost, that spirit. People paid the priests and had them chant for them, or they would give a lecture, but people didn't read the writings themselves. And Makaguchi completely changed that. So basically, what happened is those three people, Makaguchi, Toda, and Ikeda, actually created a body of work that we can access to understand that spirit of Nichiren. This is why in the Soka Gakkai our three pillars are the Gohonzon, which you described so well. I really like the way you talked about it. Nichiren Daishonin's writings, and then the guidance of the three founding presidents. Those are the pillars of the Soka Gakkai, and it's actually in our constitution that we
Hmm.
always respect those because of that very connection in an actual way. There's nothing
Yes.
theoretical about it. Makaguchi talked about everything being an experiment to prove Nichiren Daishonin's teachings true. We're the actual lab. You and me and everybody that chants and tries to solve their problems, we're a big laboratory that are showing people this is how Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism works. And that's the way we understand the writings of Nichiren Daishonin, is through that experience. And one last thing I want to say is I was told very early when I started practicing, someone that really encouraged me around the Gosho. He said, actually, you know, you're not reading the Gosho and getting something, you're actually pulling something out of your life. The Gosho is in your life already. And when we read it, we're actually awakening a wisdom that we already have, which is what Nichiren Daishonin's practice is about. We all possess the Buddha nature naturally. It's not something that's acquired or manufactured. And I think the Japanese term for it is musa, and that means uncreated or natural. So that's something
Yes.
I think is really important.
It's so important. And it was actually in our study this month, this
Yeah,
idea that
it was.
what we are talking about is that its idea of Buddhahood or enlightened nature, it is not something that is given to us. It is not made. It is not created externally. Instead, it is inherent and eternal. Very different. That totally changes this teaching and this practice because I remember I had a discussion with a friend of mine, and she's talking about how the word empower is not used in the work environment, because if a president or a management team empowers their staff, it alludes to this thing like they have the power and they give the staff some power. So it can be offensive as a term, but it's
Yeah.
very different when it's like a teaching that is empowering you, and it's not that the teaching is superior to you, when that teaching is simply reminding you of what you already have and of this condition that's eternal. That is an
Well,
incredibly different
you
state of
know,
affairs, and it's very powerful.
I'm just paraphrasing, but Nichiren says in the Gosho, because the law is supreme, the land is sacred, and the person is worthy of respect. So the oneness of
Yes.
person and the law is we're no different than Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. And that's
Yes.
actually the ultimate achievement, I think, in our practice is to recognize that our life is that. And I refer to Buddhahood as the highest form of self-esteem. If you can really and
Yes.
embody in your life that you have this power, then you have an infinite amount of hope and courage and the power to really face whatever you face. Your experience in your life, which I've heard, is really admirable. And throughout our organization, we see countless people that have shown that. And that's that laboratory again, where everybody's showing that this is how it works, you know? So,
Direct access is important, and that's why when Jose Toda, the second president, came out of jail, that was one of the first things he did was to give members access. Because if the teachings are only in the hands of the priests, we don't know what those letters actually say. And then the people who hold the writings have the power. But Toda's first thing was like, okay, everyone's going to have access. Everyone's going to study on their own to be able to benefit from that process of having a question, reading a writing, and seeing for themselves. And I think one of the reasons I read everything when I started to practice is because I was highly suspicious and I was anti religion and anti organization. At the same time, I couldn't help argue with the power of the chanting itself. It was so powerful. I thought, this is real. There's something to this. But because I was so wary of whatever power structures and manipulation and all that stuff, so I thought, okay, I'm going to read everything Nichiren wrote, just in case. I'm looking for the one thing that's going to turn me off, and I never read anything because I more and more I understood his heart. And when I understood his heart and the goal of really allowing all people to reveal their potential and lead truly great happy lives, and even the things that are a little bit more complicated to read, or it's old fashioned words from the 1200s, I'm like, I don't know what they're talking about. I'm always able to connect with his compassion. I always look for the compassion, and even in the most complicated writings, I'm like, up there it is. Oh, there it is. Right in the middle of that
well,
song,
yeah,
but
you're
it's like,
absolutely right. You know, I think the key thing in that is you find that in the human relationships, it's not a
yes.
technical or a theoretical thing where he wrote something. It's actually what he conveys to his numerous followers. Like you've mentioned, there's women, there's samurai, there's poor people, there's everybody. There was not
Yeah.
one kind. And that's what always moves me is particularly for me, it's like his relationship with his follower who was named Shijo Kingo. Like I
Mhm.
cry sometimes and I read the way he talks to this man and the love. It's really unbridled love for this other human being that comes across. That's to me embodies the spirit of Nichiren's writings.
I think that's such an important point, Ned, because you're right. It's not just the words and the statements and the theory. It's that it's the interaction with other human beings and the people around him. It's in the exchange. Like that's I've never quite thought about it
Well,
that
that
way.
actually brings to mind one thing I should have mentioned about Nietzsche, and if I throw it in now, is you'll notice in many of his letters that he's writing to his followers, the opening paragraph is entirely him making a list of all the things that they sent to him. And
Yeah.
I got 3 persimmons and
Yeah.
a small container of sake and 4 clover ice and some dried laver, and he listed everything, and he does this all the time, and actually, this is not normal. Like, priests at
Mhm.
that time, it was a given. Actually, priests were generally almost kinda wealthy at that time. In a way, they had a status. Nichiren's teacher, who was named Dozembo, when he was a young boy, we read him in the Gosho, and he says, I've carved 5 statues of Amida Buddha. And it was pointed out to me that what that means, that he actually owned 5 temples, or he had control of them. So the temples collected taxes from the land all around, and they were able to keep part of that, and the rest of it had to go to the local lord, right? So these priests had a lot of power. So say Choji, the temple where Nichiren grew up and was educated, actually had a vast land holding all through that area. And so if you were a chief priest and you collected taxes from everybody, or rice, or whatever the way they paid it, you got to keep part of it. So in fact, Dozembo was a fairly wealthy and powerful man in his own right. So these are things I didn't realize till I started to research.
What you're reminding me of is like he always had this incredible sense of gratitude to regular people. That act of writing down everything the person gave him and saying
Yeah.
thank you for it. He didn't only do high status writings on theory. Of course, he did his remonstration, but so many of his letters were just encouragement to common people, to, to all kinds of people. And I think that was really different about him as well. Correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that your average high ranking priest in those days, I don't think they spent a lot of time writing letters of encouragement to a woman or a fisherman or even a samurai. I'm
Well,
sure
if they
a
did,
lot of them,
I'm sure they haven't made it into the English language if there were any.
well, they probably thought their position wasn't to encourage a divorced mother. You know what I mean? Like they spent their time doing other things, and I think that's one of the things that makes Nichiren Daishonin
But we should
so
mention that
special.
those people we're talking about were actually the people that were working behind the scenes to have Nichiren executed. They probably talked the talk. He even says in his writings, he talks about the priest Ryokan, how Ryokan would give lectures about not even killing a mole cricket or stepping on an ant and a blade of grass. But he was the one that orchestrated Nichiren's arrest and attempted execution at Tatsunokuchi, where in 1271 he really had his head cut off. So
Yeah.
those are the people Nichiren was dealing with, and that was the nature of the Buddhist establishment in Kamakura, completely enmeshed with the secular authorities. So Nichiren
Mhm.
stood up against that, as you mentioned, a solitary man with no power in any way whatsoever. So
Mhm. And to the end of his life, did demonstrations to the end. But now, so that's a little bit about why we study and the benefits of study. And for those who don't know, we didn't introduce the word gosho. Gosho means honorable writing. So it's the word that we use for Nichiren's writing. So and rather than saying Nichiren Daishonin's writings, we'll just say gosho, and we know what we mean. so, so that's what the gosho is. And also to clarify, when I had said who is Nichiren Daishonin, we consider Nichiren Daishonin the Buddha for this time period as well, for the latter day of the law. And, that he is a Buddha, right? Not just a Japanese priest. And the reason he is a Buddha, actually, it's in Ned's book. I literally just read it before we started recording. In terms of him being the Buddha of the latter day of the law, it's not because of some occulty, mystical, weird thing. It says here, this is in Ned's book on page 224, and Nico is talking about it. And they were talking about some significance of cherry blossoms and wanting some mystical thing to happen when he died. But actually, Nico clarifies others may say such things in the future, like talking about mystic moments, essentially. But Nichiren is the Buddha of the latter day of the law because he correctly transmitted the truth of the Lotus Sutra, not because of some sort of occult power. He was very clear about that. So the reason I I personally and many other SGI members considered him to be the Buddha of the latter day of the law is because of the three proofs. So documentary, theoretical proof, and actual proof, because of what he taught, how consistent it is in terms of the Buddhist writings, and also what he actually lived, the actual proof of his life. So that's how we decide. It's really about the mission that he had and what he was able to achieve and what he was able to prove. The proof is in the result, the reality, not just theory. So anything you want to add to that, Ned?
I was just going and looking at some things the other day. I was interested in Nichiren's place of birth. And when I went in, I couldn't find anything except for a particular Nichiren sect that doesn't even view him as the Buddha of the latter day of the law. They call him Nichiren Shonin, which just means like priest. So
Mm-hmm.
it's significant. But what I found, and it's in most of them like this, is that their focus is on sort of magical stories. So they talked a lot about how all the blue algae bloomed when he died, but these are irrelevant to the truth of Nichiren's writings. And like I said, there's a footnote attached to that thing you read, and that takes you right to a passage from Nichiren's writings. He says there was a guy that could carry the ocean in his ear, or walk across flaming things, and these are all amazing things, but they don't actually uh, allow you to become a Buddha. And so that's the important thing. He talks about the Buddha. You have teachings that are from the Buddha, and then
Mm-hmm.
everything can be called a Buddhist teaching. But if you're talking about a teaching that enables you to become a Buddha, then you're just talking about the Lotus Sutra. And as you narrow that down, it becomes Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, the teaching that comes from the Lotus Sutra. And Nichiren was able to reveal and show that he was a person that could do it because he went through all that crap,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
That's
All
why,
the yeah.
and that's a lot. Like the persecutions he had are just unbelievable. The other
Yeah.
thing I want to add, one last thing, is that there were amazing things that happened to Nichiren. For example, when he was going to be beheaded, a ball of light came flashing across at 3 a.m. in the morning before the guy could bring the sword down. And the moment he passed away, there was an earthquake. But these are all verifiable things. They're in the records in Japan. You can go and
Mm-hmm.
look, and at this time, at this date, this is what happened. And so there's all sorts of records that show that that ball of light came. And actually, modern astronomers have analyzed it and figured out probably where it came from. It was like some comet that came by and something broke off. And so it wasn't about magical things. It's about the power of Nichiren's life to be in rhythm with the entire universe. And that
Exactly.
the thing about it too is that it's not isolated to him. He's a Buddha, so he had that happen. He's illustrating that this is available to all of us common mortals. We have that same power. And I know most of us really feel like, I know for myself, my rhythm has led me to so many things that have been protection or benefit, or, whatever I needed in my life, because I'm chant Nam-myoho Renge Kyo that Nichiren taught. And that puts
Mhm.
me in rhythm with the universal forces that are around me, right? And so that's how
Absolutely.
his life functioned. It's not about magic or mysticism, or that he's some sort of higher ranking type of being. He was very proud to be a fisherman's son. He's always like, that was my family. I was this. That's a really wonderful part of him.
So what Nichiren Daishonin was trying to do is allow people to overcome their suffering and fully reveal their potential. I mean, I mentioned it in the last podcast with Jenny. We talked about the Tatsunokuchi prayer. This prayer that any one of us can have at a moment of incredible struggle. In his case, he was about to be beheaded, but sometimes we might feel like that, like, oh, my life is over. I don't have any money left, or I can't handle the suffering anymore, or my doctor just said I'm going to pass away in 6 months. What those are all different versions of that same moment of feeling like my life is over as I know it, whether it's physical, mental, financial, relationship, that the feeling is my life is over as I know it. And that is a Tatsunokuchi moment. His is much more dramatic and prophesied. So there's a different significance to the Tatsunokuchi persecution when it comes to Nichiren Daishonin. However, I think that struggle and that moment of faith is the same, where we also go, no, absolutely not, this is not how this is going to go. And
Yeah.
because I'm going to chant Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, because I have a mission to help other people bring out their Buddhahood, life and the universe and the environment has to support my life. And then we chant that same kind of confident chant that he did. And that's why I love reading his writings,
Right.
because when you read his writings, you remember how to chant. Like you
Yes.
remember how it should be done,
And
you know?
as in Nichiren's moment there, which was incredibly significant, if we talk about casting off the transient and revealing the true. And this is
Oh,
such
yeah.
an important thing because Nichiren even said himself, he considered my writings before Tatsunokuchi as kind of my provisional because he was basically operating from the standpoint of a character named Bodhisattva superior practices.
Yeah.
And from that point, he revealed his true nature as the Buddha of the latter day of the law. And again, because it's Nichiren Buddhism, that is a function that also applies to all of us. So, like you described, when we have those moments of horrific challenge that leave us breathless, that is something we think about and we can realize this is the moment. And what's the difference between making it happen and not is do we continue to chant no matter what? And no matter what is one of the most used phrases throughout the whole writing. Nichiren says it many times. He's no matter what. And what does it mean? You really think about that, when we don't quit and we
Yeah.
continue to believe in ourselves and our great potential. I've been really encouraged recently by something from Daisaku Ikeda that because I'm going through a lot of stuff right now. I'm really chanting, and he talks about transforming evil into good, loss into benefit, and baseness into beauty. And really, those things are so powerful because it illustrates a complete transformation on such a fundamental level, and that's what this practice is about.
So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the book. How many years did it take you to write it?
From conception to
Yeah.
publishing was 4 years. Yeah,
Wow.
and,
And
yeah.
48 years of study altogether, right?
Well,
Or
and
40
actually on
plus.
top of that too is I had been writing for about 10 years and published as a writer for 10 years before I even attempted. I'd thought about it before and I didn't feel ready. I didn't feel that my writing was good enough. I first got published in 2010, continued to write still. I'm writing. I
Uh-huh.
just finished a science fiction novel. What happened was um, in 2019, I'd been thinking about it over the years, and historical fiction dramas like HBO. There's one called Rome, for example, and
Mhm.
looking at them, I started to realize, oh, this is interesting, because you use fictional characters, and it helps you to become more objective, right? Like if it's strictly around the characters that exist, then you're stuck with history, which is important if you're trying to educate people, but that's not the purpose of a historical fiction thing. You also want to entertain. So that's when I realized that historical fiction could be a way that I could approach it. But I didn't start it. And then 2019, I was riding my bike to work in January and I hit some black ice and I had a very bad accident and actually ended my work career and put me in pain. At that time, I was reading a writing of Nichiren's called The Actions of the Votary of the Lotus Sutra, which he wrote to a very staunch female follower, actually. And it's an autobiographical writing where just before the Tatsunokuchi persecution, he starts explaining what was going on. It describes the actual execution attempt. It's really good.
I
And
just read it on Friday.
oh,
I just
fabulous.
read it,
Yeah.
Ned. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, so anyways, one little thing in it though, he's talking about being on Sado Island where he was exiled, and he says, I gave the writing to Shijo Kingo's messenger, who was his follower, the samurai follower in Kamakura, who had actually been with him at Tatsunokuchi when the brilliant light went over. He had run down to try and stop the execution and hung on to Nichiren's horse. It's so beautiful. When I read that, I thought, who's that messenger? Like Nichiren says, I gave it to. So who did Shijo Kingo send to Sado Island right after he had been exiled there, which would have been really dangerous because for Shijo Kingo's position in society, what kind of person would he ask? So I wrote the story. The very first one was called The Messenger, and it's in the book there. And
Mm.
that's what it came from, was just thinking about that. And then it made me realize there's so many people in the writings Nichiren talks about, and we don't know their names. There's writings that they don't know who it was written to. They've all disappeared, but their impact is internal in a way. So from
Mhm.
that point, it just started to come out. And I was in real pain. Like I really hurt myself neurologically and physically. It was very difficult. But, after 1 year, I had the first draft of the book. And
Wow.
then the next part was hard. But, I needed to find a good editor and I couldn't find anybody. And then I found a business card from somebody I'd met like 8 years before in the United States. And I messaged this person and said, "Hey, would you read a couple of these stories? I need a little bit of help." She says, "Well, I don't know if I can help you with it." I sent her an email. Like 2 days later, she was like, "Oh man, these are like charming." She called them. I have a friend in Japan, she says, that is really in a good position maybe to help. But she's so busy, it'll take like a month or two. And so she did that. And like a week later, I get an email back like, "Whoa, hey." Well, and they told me where I needed to go. And because of their weight, if you will, it kind of opened up my ability to get to two people that were able to edit it. And one is a really good
Amazing.
Japanese scholar. So that helped. And so they had it for 6 months and it came back and I was devastated because I realized how much I didn't know. I didn't know how much I didn't know before they got a hold of it because I can't read Japanese and there's so much history that we don't have translated into English. I mean, we have all the
Mhm.
relevant things about how to practice and get benefit, and that's all that really counts. But, historical details about mythology and things that are true or not true were things I started to find out. So I rewrote about half of the book in constant meetings with this scholar every week. We met for 6 months on Zoom, and it was so much fun to just talk about Nichiren's writing, his life, just unbridled, and really dig in and say, well, what about this? Why is this so nuanced? And I learned so much from that about the spirit of Nichiren and that it's always based on the human connection. It's always based
Mm.
on reality and logic.
I'm sure you learned so much, especially weekly meetings for 6 months and your own work. What would you say were the most surprising things that you learned in that period?
Just how many different stories there are about Nichiren. And I guess the way to put that is over a period of 700 years, there's been a huge mythology built up around Nichiren. Like when you go to Japan, you can go to places in Kamakura, there's a plaque that talks about how when he was going to be attacked at what's called Matsubagayatsu in
Mhm.
1261, I think it was, he lived in a little area. That's the Valley of Pine Needles, actually, Matsubagayatsu. That's a translation. So he
Uh,
was going to be attacked by hundreds and hundreds of Nembutsu believers who were coming to kill him because he had written on securing the peace of the land through the propagation of the true law and
yeah.
submitted to the government, and they didn't like it.
Yes,
Everybody
you
was
can.
pissed off. Right? And so instead of doing something themselves, unofficially, they goaded all these people to go with torches and pitchforks to his place. And he managed to just escape at the last minute. That's actually the story in the book, the very first one, called In the Valley of Pine Needles. Later on, around the 16th, 17th century, a story came out that it was actually monkeys that helped him to escape. Well, this kind of stuff, this is what I learned, is all these different things or situations where the founder of a different Nichiren sect, for example, they would create a history where a person from their sect was somewhere where they couldn't have been. But they were with Nichiren when Nichiren was attacked at a ambush at a particular place in Japan, and that they were wounded. But I found out
Yeah.
later, even though this is written in their files, if you will, it didn't happen. That person wasn't there.
Mhm.
So I had to rewrite two stories just because of information I had originally got by reading all the English websites, tourist sites that have lots of interesting stuff about Nichiren. But again, you find out later that it came from sort of a more mythological element. So I didn't realize that in Japan there was such mythology around Nichiren because I've always practiced based on the Soka Gakkai and our clear view of what he was. Although I did have one interesting experience in Japan. I was at a park in a place near my wife's family's house, and there's actually a museum. The workshop of the sculptor that did this thing at Hiroshima. There's a big statue of the guy sitting with his arm out like this. It represents peace. But I went into this workshop that had been his years ago and is preserved as museum. And there's a statue of this demon-looking guy like this, and it said Nichiren on it. And I was like, wow. And so you can see, there's all sorts of views of Nichiren in Japan. He was obviously very outspoken, and
Yeah, he
and it,
was
and it
very, yeah.
went against the propriety of the time too, where, oh, you don't do that. This teaching has been around for 400 years, and it's the basis of our Japanese system. Why are you talking out against it? Because that's basically everybody was in shock to
Mhm.
realize that somebody was attacking what they felt were the foundations of their whole society, right? So
And just to give a quick example, he would attack Nembutsu. And the reason he attacked that faith is because this idea of having a pure land to go to when you die, he said, took away basically power from people because it was teaching people that it's okay to suffer in this lifetime. In fact, you need to suffer. And the only time that you're going to get an easing of your suffering is when you're dead. And when
right.
you're dead, you're going to go to nirvana, version of heaven, but what that was doing is really making people weak and passive and acquiescing to authority. And Nichiren was saying, that's not okay, basically,
Mm.
right? Because
Yeah.
because he was saying, no, actually, all of you are Buddhas with incredible potential. And just like Toda said, there's no reason for you to accept suffering as your destiny,
That's right.
and therefore this teaching is causing damage to our society. This teaching is causing damage to all the lives, and will be a cause for our demise. We will have invasions, we will have more challenges, and so he would say this belief is the problem, and that writing on establishing the correct teaching for the peace of the land that caused these people to show up with pitchforks pitchforks and torches and stuff. Essentially, it was a wake up writing. It was basically saying everybody needs to change, everybody needs to question the tenets that they hold dear in their heart and wake up to the truth of what the Lotus Sutra is saying, which is that everybody has Buddhahood. And that notion that notion brought pitchforks to his door. This idea of equality just makes people go crazy. And even today, right? Even today, obviously.
For our time, the latter day of the law. It's in the sutra. Shakyamuni, the first Buddha on this planet, you look at it, there's no doubt what he was talking about. And Nichiren fulfilled all of that. And that's why he talked about being so joyful about going through persecution. But that
Mhm.
point is really important, is that we could read those sutras and get benefit and find things out, and you
Yes.
learn about culture, it's good. But if you took that sutra and said this is more important than Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, you're depriving people the opportunity to manifest their own Buddha nature. And that's what the problem is, because then the land starts to degrade, the people's life condition degrades. And then, as Nichiren says, protective forces leave the land, it gets replaced by demons. And, that's the terminology he uses, but he's really talking about negativity. That negativity of human life really affects the environment, right? This is another Buddhist principle, oneness of life in the environment, right? So these things are all tied into what he's talking.
I want to go to some of the stories in the book.
Sure.
What's your favorite story in the whole?
Well, it's complicated because there's two elements. One is as a writer. I have a favorite
Yeah.
story as a writer, and that's the one called Yasumitsu, which is
Okay.
about the father of the Ikegami brothers. He told them, you stop practicing Nichiren's Buddhism, or else I'm going to disown you to the older brother, which was horrendous if that happened.
In
You're
those days,
outcast.
yeah.
Yeah, in those days, right? And their battle of unity and support and love for Nichiren Daishonin that enabled them to come to a point where their father actually began to practice. But the father was being manipulated by Ryokan, that priest I talked about who tried to get Nichiren killed. So I like that story as a writer because it was a real challenge to convey a number of things in it. Writing from
Mhm.
the standpoint of the father was very difficult because there's no information about him, right? But I felt like I was able to move through time because it's like a 10-year period. And I felt I successfully did that as a writer. The mechanism I utilized took him from in the present to all the stuff that needed to happen and then brought it back. And so I was very happy about that.
I do want to say something about that story because I thought was really impressive in that. And for those who don't know, the brothers do stick together, and their wives are a big part of the story. And I noticed that in your book overall, you really take the time to mention all the women involved and the role that they would have played. Like, so it's not just the two brothers, it's their wives as well. All four stayed strong, as
Yes.
and as many people know, it's much easier when the women are on board
Absolutely, and that
as
was
well.
actually, that was my
Yeah.
motivation in that story, now that you mentioned it, is I thought about that, and I thought it had to be the care that he got somehow. The way the society was structured is the women would have been looking after him, and that's why I created in the story, an incident where he hurts his ankle. He gets a broken
Mhm.
foot, and she looks after him for years. And it just became a vehicle to express that. There's actually one thing I discovered that was surprising was that in the Kamakura period, actually women's situation was much better than in later periods in Japan. So at that time, women could inherit property. And there were
Oh,
many instances of women that were village stewards around Japan. I'm not saying it was great.
and so what's the other one that's your favorite? Not as a
Emotionally, I like Unity, which is the one
Mm.
about the young girl that was hiding in Nanjo Tokumitsu's house and was a villager from Atsahara who had been severely punished, to the point that 20 of the villagers were actually taken away to Kamakura and tortured by the magistrate of the realm. The second most powerful person in Japan was named Hei no Saimon, and he was brutal. And they tortured them and told them if they would let them go if they chanted the Nembutsu rather than Nam-myoho Renge Kyo. And these were peasants, and none of them gave in. They said no. And so
incredible.
17 were released by the efforts of Nichiren and Nikko Shonin, and they by writing letters and the legal part of it, they got 17 of them released. But Hei no Samon beheaded three brothers, uh, and they're called the Atsahara martyrs in history. I
Yeah.
visited their grave actually in Japan a couple of times. And
One of the things that I noticed when I read your book, there's a couple of scenes where some of the violence is made really clear. You know, when we think of 100 soldiers showing up at your door, we don't think about the reality, what that looked like, or being hit over the head, or something like the Atsahara persecution. Those were violent times. Sometimes I think when we read the writings, we don't appreciate the depth of the fight that Nichiren had to endure and the spirit that he had to have. It wasn't just powerful writings and nice poetic spirit. There was people that got hurt. He got hurt, and moments when his life was truly on the line. So what comes with that is some of the violence that happened at that time in Japan in the 1200s. I can't find another
oh, it
sentence
was
for
a
that.
military society. The Kamakura regime was the first military government in Japan's history. The samurai overthrew the emperor in 1192 or something, and
Oh,
that was the Minamoto clan that broke through with that and established the government, moved it from Kyoto to Kamakura. So Kamakura was like the Wild West. And that's why all these priests would show up, and Zen priests, because they knew, hey, there's a new government. And so they came there and they started to curry favor. And the samurai loved the Zen. They were like, oh man, we don't have to do anything. We don't have to study. We just have to sit. And so, of course, for a samurai, they're disciplined. They can do that. And it was also a rebellion against the existing aristocracy, right? Who followed Tendai and Mahavarachana, or the true word teaching. That was more the traditional thing, and Zen was this newer thing. So it's very similar to what happened in North America in the 60s, where Zen became very popular in North America. And a lot of it was just not so much the philosophy, but the rejection of the existing establishment, along with the Vietnam protests. And, so I look at that, and this is my own thinking in a way, obviously,
Yeah.
but I see a parallel in the way that happened. So that was the place where Nichiren came to really spread his teaching, was this city that was just wild because of all the different influences and opportunities and dangers, and throw in like earthquakes and pestilence and natural disasters and war constantly. That's a pretty wild time.
And of course, that's where he'd go. I was watching a video the other day. It talked about how he was exiled to Sado, and that was an
Yes.
island that most people didn't come back alive from. So when they took him there, nobody expected him to come back. And he managed to make friends and get allies and have people that supported him. And he managed to be released from Sado alive. And what was surprising in that writing that I didn't know, because there's a quote from him, and he's saying, "Oh, you would think that when I was released from Sado, that I would just go hide in a forest or hide in the mountains because I just survived Sado. So I might take it down a notch a little bit and go quiet somewhere." And instead, he went back and remonstrated with Heino Simon in 13 days. I think it took him 13 days to go right back in and ask for a meeting. And he had this attitude, even if I save one life by doing this, then I will do it. Because he did it not to argue, obviously. He was doing it because he just did not want people to be suffering any longer. And he felt like he needed to convince the rulers that be, so that the suffering of people would be diminished. And he was like, if I can save one life, I'm going to go and talk to him again. And that spirit of courage is just phenomenal. For me, there's two sections that I love. I mean, I love the whole book, and I would say what comes through in this book is your love of Nietzsche. And there's this warmth, and there's this purity and sincerity that comes through in these writings, the way you talk about the characters, the way you talk about Nietzsche. And what comes through is that everywhere he went, he was able to make friends with ordinary people. Like that's what happened. He was a single person, a single human being, and yet everywhere he went, even though the world around him was fraught with danger, he managed to befriend people. And there was something about him, his compassion, his character, that really impressed people. They trusted him, they supported him, and they followed his teachings. It's quite an incredible thing. And I think you referred to it in the foreword, actually. I'm going to read your own stuff to you now, Ned. You speak about that in the chapter called The Buddha from the Sea. This is your intro to that story. And you say, it was there in Izu that a compelling narrative began to develop. Wherever he went, people from local communities became his followers. While often at risk of serious repercussion, these individuals supported him, thus enabling him to continue revealing his awe inspiring view of life and the universe. Nietzsche was a man without wealth, status, or influence, and yet through the power of his humanity, his Buddha nature per se, wherever he went, he won the admiration of ordinary people. And that just really struck me in this book. And then now I look at the writings differently as well. It's like this, it wasn't some magical mystical power he had. It was his humanity, this
Yes.
incredible force of humanity that he had. When people met him, they knew they could trust it. They had encountered something different, and something pure and something strong, and they were able to trust it. And I think the same thing happened with the three presidents as well:
Yes,
Nakaguchi,
exactly.
Jose Toda,
Well,
Daisaku Ikeda.
Yeah, Nichiren says in his writing, purpose of Shakyamuni Buddha's appearance in this world lay in his behavior as a human being. That's a
Yeah.
really important passage from the writings. It sums up everything about
Yes,
what should be the end result of our practice. We should become better human beings.
that's right. And the proof is in our actual behavior and in our daily life. And it's funny, you just reminded me, there's a longtime member who read the whole Wisdom of the Lotus Sutra series. I think it's 6 volumes, if I'm not mistaken. And she read all of them, and she got to the end, and there's a lot in that. It's a big read, that one,
Yeah.
right? And she got to the end, and she said, the end of the day, the conclusion of all 6 volumes is that it's all about our behavior as human beings. So we study in depth, but that's the conclusion we get to. We go back to, what kind of a person am I going to be today? And also, how can I transform my sufferings to facilitate growth and to make me an even better human being? How do I bring out that transformative power as a human being, and show proof of what's possible, basically? So did you finish what you were when you were saying about your favorite one?
Well, my emotional favorite in the book is the one called Unity, because I love the whole thing about the Atsuhara martyrs, which always really moved me. Peasant believers that stood up to show the power of Nichiren's teachings. And within the story itself, I like the characters. The lay nun Ueno, who was the mother of Nanjo Tokumitsu, a young lord who was a very close follower of Nichiren, and his father had been, but died when he was a little boy. Being able to write about them and think about them, it was beautiful. One thing in the story is the little girl has a little dog named Chestnut, a little brown dog. And when the Atsuhara martyrs or the peasants were attacked, they were out in their field cutting the wheat. And these samurai, goaded on by a priest from a local temple, they charged in on their horses and they were actually hurting people, cutting people. And so in the story, I have this one charging at the little girl on his horse, and the little dog runs over the horse and the horse bucks. And actually, he is a guy that really died at that time, Oda Chikamasa. And he was a
Oh,
follower of Nietzsche who turned against him. But then he died horribly by falling off his horse at this persecution. That's real, actually. But this little chestnut guy was the name of my 8-year-old guinea pig who just passed away 2 weeks ago. So I, I read the story and I cry because I think of my
oh,
little guy and how much joy he brought me for all those years. And I also like it because the bond that came between the lay nun Ueno and the little girl, they're from different statuses, right? She was a wife of a lord, and she was a peasant girl. And I think that would have been true. This is the thing. These are my own things. But when I thought about it, how would it feel? Like, how would these people relate? And reading Nichiren's writings and thinking about it, and what I felt was that this was amazing. This kind of connection that occurred between the various peoples of the time would have been really unique in terms of crossing the boundaries of status and to all become Nichiren's followers, you know.
and I think that came out.
I should add one thing, because actually, in the reality of the situation, many of Nichiren's upper class followers really went out of their way to support peasant believers. Like Toki Jonin, he wrote letters to the government when the 20 people were taken from Atsuhara. He wrote a letter, a petition demanding justice. And, other ones took them into their homes. And this was great risk for these people. Actually, Nanjo Tokumitsu at one point couldn't even have a house, or, I mean, a horse, or give clothing to his children because the government came down on him so hard for supporting these peasants. Yeah, they taxed him unreasonably and demanded men for work projects. It's quite a real thing. And he weathered all of it. These people stood up for these people that were totally a different station of life, so to speak.
That's amazing. And as you just said, it would have been a very unique situation at that time, that you had unity amongst all these different types of people coming from different walks of life, stations of life, and yet were united with Nichiren's teachings because they actually practiced the teaching. Because the teaching says that every single person has Buddhahood. And the fact that Nichiren Daishonin was able to turn that into a reality, he always says with this letter, read it with
Yes.
everybody when you come back. He was always encouraging, I'm going to write this one letter to one person, but please read it to everybody else. I always think of that as the original discussion meeting. In SGI, we have discussion meetings and we read writings together. And I thought the origins of that is Nichiren Daishonin writing one letter and saying, read it together with everybody else. And I thought, yeah, first discussion meeting.
Absolutely.
So I think when President Ikeda says we practice in the real spirit of Nichiren Daishonin's time, that's just one aspect. We study together and we discuss, and we all speak to each other with a level of respect and encouragement. Doesn't matter which, socioeconomic background, whatever race. We're actually practicing the teaching in real terms, the way it was intended to be practiced.
Like
And so I
fish
think
and the water in which they swim.
that's right. That's right. Yeah, no, that was absolutely a beautiful story. And for me, the one that made me cry was at the very end. I don't even think I could read it without crying. There's so many stories I loved, and I loved watching all these characters come to life.
It was fairly diligent in the footnotes, and I've tried to, there's actually a section that explains Shijo Kingo's name and breaks it down into what it means and where each one came from. Yoritomo was his given name, for example. Shijo is a family name. Kingo is a title that's an abbreviation of Simon Ojo. But I don't know how
Mm.
they get Kingo out of that, but somehow in Japanese it works.
I didn't go to the footnotes, but I figured
So
it
then
out.
it's your own fault, right?
It is my own fault. So the next question I want to ask you about, what were your challenges in writing the book? You must have had all kinds of challenges.
I did. And as I mentioned, physically, right? I had to stop working at that time because I was injured and I was on a disability. To tell you the truth, what I did was I turned my focus to helping other people. And I spent that year really trying to encourage the men's members in the part of SGI that I'm responsible for here in Vancouver. And it was a huge thing. I really turned something, even though I didn't necessarily feel better, but spiritually, I really grew. Like I grew as a person and broke through some really incredible things because of it. Was it and just the challenge around finding the right way to put the book together. I'm very fortunate. My sister is an incredible artist, and she gave me that image for the front. And then my son helped me with the technical part of how to layer it so we could have the Japanese character. So it was really a nice unified effort by people that I love.
Family effort.
Yeah, to do that.
That's
So
beautiful.
I have to say that it was a really joyful period of my life. I never felt so much joy writing as I did when I was writing that. And I wrote the book to help people make that connection and to convey it, but it also infiltrated me as a person. I try not to talk theoretically anymore. I mean, I can if people want, but don't see the point per se in explaining every detail of 3,000 worlds in a momentary state of existence, unless I'm putting somebody to sleep. Any insomniacs out there, it's very effective. Just call me up, you know.
Well,
So
I am actually going to do a podcast on Ichiren Sanzen, so hang on, Ned. But I will try to make it exciting and not put anybody to sleep. I think if you base yourself on really sincere study and chanting and practice, once your core is solid, then I think you can have the freedom and confidence to share the heart of Nichiren Daishonin in a different way without sticking to official words. We have more ability to express these profound concepts in a very accessible way. And if you look at Buddhism over these 2,500 years, and you look at Shakyamuni, Lotus Sutra, Nichiren, Three Presidents, 2025, this has been a process of accessibility. The whole thing, all these years, are about access. Shakyamuni Buddha expresses enlightenment, says, in that time, for that time period, you can have access by your association with me. Then in the Lotus Sutra, really expands everything, and everybody can attain enlightenment because of the Lotus Sutra. So bigger access. Then you get to Nichiren Daishonin in the 1200s, and you've still got a situation where people don't have access. It's very difficult to bring out your Buddhahood as a common person and through all walks of society. Nichiren Daishonin, dramatic removal of boundaries. All of a sudden, everybody has access. There is this chant that anybody can chant, and there is a Gohonzon that anybody can get. And then you get to the 1930 with Makaguchi, and then Toda, and then Ikeda, and that is completely expanding access. Makaguchi via education as an educator, Toda as a lay organization, and then when you get to Daisaku Ikeda, holy, all of a sudden you have got Buddhism being expressed through poetry, through dialogues with people who study physics, politicians, all kinds of leaders. And all of a sudden you have got Buddhist philosophy flourishing through all facets, and you have completely opened up access. So I think the work that you did with this book is in that spirit of expanding access to Nichiren's life, his heart, his spirit. I think it's a huge accomplishment. And that's what I'm kind of trying to do with the podcast. Is there any advice in terms of motivating and inspiring people to connect directly with Nichiren's writings? Because we can read lectures and we can read quotes, but there is an incredible power to connecting directly with Nichiren's writings. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, it's a really good question because it gets to the crux of everything, really. There's simple things, finding the shorter ones. There's many famous Gosho,
Mm.
Happiness in This World, The Difficulty of Sustaining Faith on Attaining Buddhahood. These are all really good ones. So just in your own time, you can read those. The second bit of advice, be consistent. Like you're reading Nichiren Daishonin's writings is actually a practice. It's not really a pastime like reading a fictional novel. And you got to prepare yourself. Think about it. Because, and the third thing is if you can make a connection with a senior person, let's say, I'll use that word. Or in our SGI organization, there's many people that have many years experience about reading the Gosho. People that influenced me were people that spoke terrible English when I was a young
Mhm.
man, to be honest, and our translations weren't that great yet in 1977. But I was so inspired by their spirit to want to read the writings of Nichiren Daishonin. So that's a really important thing. If you can study them with someone that knows about them and read them
Mhm.
together, you'll advance. And I guess one last thing I'd have to say is take the leap, and you start with on securing the peace of the land through the propagation of Buddhism, and read one of those big, long, scary doctrinal ones. I know it's hard, but if you read one, then everything opens up because they all have a similar pattern. That's what I started to realize is Nichiren uses the same sort of pattern, but he'll come at it from a different perspective. So this is really important to start to understand that there's a method to this madness. It's not just like, what the hell is all this? Of course, you're not going to understand a lot of the mythology and things, but there's footnotes. So take the time to look at the footnotes. This is the 32nd generation, but be consistent. Find someone that you can read with once in a while, because once you get the seed to get going, the thing about reading the writings in Nichiren Daishonin, you may not understand what you read. It doesn't matter. Just read it. And then in 3 years or 5 years, you'll go through something and you'll know what that meant. You'll go like, oh, I remember that. Wow, that's what that meant. And this happens through your whole life. It still happens to me all the time. I am no expert on the writings of Nichiren Daishonin. I am not. I don't proclaim to be a scholar, but I really love them and they are embedded in the fabric of my life. The last advice is every opportunity you get, read the lectures by Daisaku Ikeda on any
Yes.
writing because
Yeah.
they are the best. No one in the world conveys the spirit of Nichiren Daishonin better, and he's our mentor, right?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
that's what I would
Absolutely.
say. Yeah.
Thanks, Ned. The writings that I read over and over again that were the foundation of my practice are On Attaining Buddhahood in This Lifetime, Reply to Kyo-O, and The Strategy of the Lotus Sutra. That one is page 1000, so I always remember it, page 1000. So there's a couple of these shorter ones. Just because they're short doesn't mean they're not important or powerful. And another way of looking at it is if you look at all the writings to lay believers, those are letters of encouragement. Those are letters of encouragement to ordinary people. So I think those are always amazing. Anything to Shijo Kengo, I love because he had a temper and just like I do. And but yet he was sincere. So there's a lot of things that I can relate to in anything written to Shijo Kengo. As was said, all of it's good. Like flip the book open. Oh, another cool thing that I would highly recommend doing that I've done in the past couple of years. There's a website called nichirenlibrary.org, and it's all of Nichiren's writings online, volume 1, volume 2, orally transmitted teachings, and the Soka Gakkai dictionary, all on one website. But what I've done a few times is I've just put in one word and then see what comes up. And one time I was looking for a writing on the boy Snow Mountain. I
Oh,
can't remember what
Snow
his name
Mountain,
was.
right.
Yeah, Snow Mountain. So I typed in the word snow, and then I got all these different writings that I don't normally read. And I'm like, oh, so those are some of the resources out there. I'm going to list them. I'll put them in the comments below this video. But the main thing is to just start and just pick one or two or three. As much as I have mentioned the lectures and I've mentioned the short little quotes, I think it's really important just to read the whole thing, you know, the background, the footnotes, and just have one writing that you read from top to bottom. And every month in SGI, we have a study meeting. And those study meetings are often on a lecture from Daisaku Ikeda on some of Nichiren's writings. The people that give the lectures, they don't necessarily read the whole writing. That's a great place to start. The next time there's a study meeting, read the whole writing rather than just the excerpt. I think that's an amazing place to
Yes.
start, right? You will
Good
come into
advice.
right? You will come
Right.
it's yours. You wrote it down
Oh, oh,
in your notes to me. Yeah, so I think that's that will completely change the study meeting for you. Not only will you have come in contact with nature and spirit directly in terms of learning and understanding, but you might also bring some questions to the study meeting and
I was
things to
going
think
to
about.
say that is a really important aspect of it. As a seeker, your presence in a meeting where people are studying it will bring so much. Like when someone comes and asks questions, it opens up things that we'd never think to talk about or ask. And I always end up learning something,
Yeah,
because that perspective is so important. So it's a two-sided thing. It's like you get to learn something, but you, being the seeker of Nichiren Daishonin's Buddhism, will make an incredible cause for other people that are there, and you'll be highly
exactly.
rewarded.
That's right. And also, I think sometimes people come to a study meeting expecting the key person to convey the material. I think when you come to a meeting and think, "Oh, this is my study meeting and I have some questions or I'm going to contribute something that I read." I think it's incredibly valuable contribution that you're making when you come to a study meeting with that attitude. Like this is your meeting. And that's one of the reasons I love preparing. And I always do a study prep for the meetings in my chapter because there's something magical that happens in those study preps. Like it's got to be one of my favorite meetings of the month. And the reason is because the study prep in our chapter is not mandatory. Nobody has to come. Well, nothing's mandatory in SGI, but because that study prep is an extra meeting, it's actually not official. It's not part of the normal guidelines. So the people that come to that study prep are really coming because they have a seeking mind and they want to learn. and we're all figuring it out together. We have a chance to ask questions, figure out what's the most important thing to read, and try to have experiences based on the study. I'm telling you, there's something magical that happens at those study preps. It's something like so exciting and living, breathing, like everybody's faces light up by the end of that meeting, because there's this exertion of life and a seeking mind and asking questions. To wrap up for today, I'd like to end with your favorite quote from Nichiren Daishonin.
Well, this is one from The Three Kinds of Treasure, which is page 850 in volume 1. And I love it because it illustrates the relationship between Nichiren and Shijo Kingo. And it goes, over and over I recall the moment, unforgettable even now, when I was about to be beheaded and you accompanied me, holding the reins of my horse and weeping tears of grief. Nor could I ever forget it in any lifetime to come. If you should fall into hell for some grave offense, no matter how Shakyamuni Buddha might urge me to become a Buddha, I would refuse. I would rather go to hell with you. For if you and I should fall into hell together, we would find Shakyamuni Buddha and the Lotus Sutra there. It would be as if the moon were illuminating the darkness, as if cold water were pouring into hot, as if fire were melting ice, or as if the sun were dispelling the darkness. And it just
Beautiful.
conveys everything about their relationship, right?
Yeah, I mean, I love it. This idea that even if Shijo Kingo goes to hell, Nichiren Daishonin would pass on nirvana and go to hell with him.
Yeah.
And by being together in hell, they would light up hell. They would transform hell with their bond and their spirit. It's got so many layers of encouragement.
Which is what we can all do, right?
That's right.
Everywhere we are. Hell is the
Everywhere
Buddha
we
land.
are. Exactly. We can transform anything. Now, for me, for my ending, I'm actually going to read the last part of your book. And the last chapter is about the passing of Nichiren Daishonin and the people that would have been around at that time: Shijo Kingo, Nikko Shonin, and Nanjo Takamitsu. So I'm just going to read this section. Nikko gazed into the distance for a few moments. He then turned to Tokamitsu. Nichiren once wrote to you, "My wish is that all my disciples make a great vow. We have the Gohonzon and his sacred writings. We must remain true to our vow and propagate his teachings no matter what." "Yes," said Nichimoku, "no matter what." A look of satisfaction settled on Nico's face. "Well, you should get going. I'm sure you want to make time before dark. Give my best regards to your family." Nico wheeled his horse and rode away from the two men. In future, when others had betrayed him, Nico would find them amongst his most stalwart supporters. "No matter what," he said again, his heart firm, his conviction unparalleled. "Nam-myoho Renge Kyo is like the roar of a lion." Nico Shonin placed his hand on the saddlebag. He felt no distance from his master. Death could not separate them. The sun slid to the horizon as the lofty peak of Fuji came into view. I just love that so much. It's so appropriate for us now, as Daisaku Ikeda has passed away 2 years ago. And now it's like the same feeling of no matter what, we have the teachings, we have Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, and we just have to keep, roaring that lion's roar. I love the line where he says he felt no distance from his master, death could not separate them. So for me, that when I read that whole chapter, as I was in tears for half of it, and it's this moment of now it's our time. We got to stand up. We got to keep going. And we have everything we need in the writings of Nichiren Daishonin and Daisaku Ikeda. So thank you so much, Ned, for this
Thank you,
time
Lydia. Really
together. And,
appreciate it.
and thank you so much for writing this book. So
Let's
much.
read the Go Show, right?
Yes. Yeah, let's read the Ghost Show. After all of that,
Yeah,
let's just read the writings. That's all we need. So
yeah. Right.
thank you so much. And for everybody else, we'll see you next time. Thank you so much for joining us.